Okay, so what I'm going to do today is talk about game theory and the gospel. And so I call today Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a reference to a classical game theory scenario that we're going to talk about in a second. But just I want to give you a reference. I've been drawing quite a bit from this book called Biblical Games, Game Theory in the Hebrew Bible by Stephen Brahms. And so you can check it out. He was a professor of politics at New York University and did an analysis of how game theory, which is a tool often used in economics and poli-sci and even psychology and some of these other areas, can be used to help us make sense of the Bible. And so we're going to go through a few biblical stories today and see how this game framework can help us make sense of perhaps some challenging stories. So what I want to do is begin by just reminding you or introducing you to the idea of a prisoner's dilemma. And so the basic setup is you have two individuals who have been arrested and have been interrogated. And so each one has a choice that they can either confess to the crime. So we have prisoner A who can confess to the crime, or he can remain silent. He can refuse to confess. And then his co-conspirator, prisoner B, is in the same situation where prisoner B can also confess to the crime or remain silent. And so each of them are trying to decide what they should do, what should be their strategy. Let me zoom in on this just a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. And we're going to be using this quite a bit today, so let me make that nice and big for you. So here we go. Okay, we have these two prisoners, prisoner A and prisoner B. Now, if both remain silent, the cops, they don't have too much on them, but let's suppose the cops have a little bit of evidence against them and they're able to nail them for something. So if they both remain silent, let's say they both go to jail for one year. There's enough evidence against them to lock them away for 1 year. And so I'm doing one in red to indicate prisoner A would be in jail for 1 year, and the one in green to indicate prisoner B will also have 1 year in jail. If, on the other hand, they both confess, well, if they both confess, now they're both clearly guilty, and they both have 5 years in prison because they did the crime. Okay, great. So you have these two scenarios. Now it seems pretty obvious they should remain silent, right? But here's where things get a little bit interesting. If A confesses and B remains silent, the police say, okay, A, since you confessed, we're going to let you go off. We're going to let you go free, and we're going to throw the whole weight of the law against B. You've confessed, you've implicated B, but you cooperated, so we'll let you go free, and we're going to throw the whole weight of the law against B, so B will have all 10 years in prison. He'll serve alone. And on the other hand, if B confesses, so then the B gets to go free, and if A doesn't, A remains silent, then A has to serve the entire sentence of 10 years. Okay, we can tweak those values, but here's one way you might imagine setting up this dilemma. And so the dilemma now arises, what should the prisoners do? Each is being questioned separately. A is in A's cell, and they're being told, okay, if you confess, this is what will happen. If you don't confess, and they're trying to decide what to do independently, two separate rooms. Okay, so I want to give you guys a chance to think about this, and maybe you can tell me, think about it for a second, what would be your strategy? Say you're in your room, you're being questioned, you're trying to decide, should I confess, should I remain silent? What would you decide? Who would remain silent? And would anyone confess? Okay, we're getting kind of mixed. Anyone have any reasoning for why you would do what you think you would want to do?
Well, the first question is, are you guilty?
Yeah, okay, well, they are guilty. Both are guilty. Both committed the crime. Yeah, you shouldn't confess if you're not guilty. Both are guilty. That's a good question.
I would just stay silent.
Yeah, so you would stay silent and hope the other guy does too, right? Is that kind of the idea? I'll stay silent. I hope the other guy does too. And maybe there's a bond.
So question,
Yeah.
Is it clear that we only get 1 year from the get-go, or is it unclear?
All this knowledge is given to you. You know this whole situation. So you have it's a perfect knowledge game. You have perfect knowledge of what all the outcomes will be based upon your actions and the action of the other. Yeah, so maybe there's a special bond between you and the other, and you're really committed to stay silent, and you're like, this is, I grew up with this guy, I know he's going to stay silent too, we're locked in, we're only going to get 1 year, this is great. But if you don't have that connection with the other person, and you're just thinking, well, let me analyze, what might the other person do? If the other person's going to confess, what should you do? Just out of your own self-interest, what should you do? If you suspect the other person is going to confess, what would be the rational move for you?
Confess.
Yeah, you would want to confess, because if they're going to confess, you're either going to get stuck with 5 years in prison or 10 years in prison, and so you'd rather have just the 5 years in prison, right? You don't want them to go free and you serve all 10. You'd rather split it with them, and so it would make sense for you to confess. On the other hand, if you expect the other person to remain silent, what would you do? Well, let's see. If you're expecting the other person to remain silent, you have two options. You can confess or remain silent. But which one is better for just you?
Confess.
Yeah, if you confess, then you get to go free. So regardless of what the other player does, it's in your own self-interest to confess. Does that make sense? If they confess, you should confess. If they stay silent, you should stay silent. So you say, regardless of what they do, you should confess. But by the exact same reasoning, this other player's in the other room, and they're thinking, okay, well, regardless of what you do, they should confess. And so what ends up happening is you both reason your way to both confessing. And then you both end up serving 5 years in prison, and strangely, paradoxically, when you could have just served 1 year. But somehow it became in your self-interest to confess. And so this game rigs it in such a way that your self-interest drive you to confess, which leads to something that may seem like it's against the overall self-interest. After all, if you're both going to confess, it doesn't make sense for any person to deviate. If you're both in this place, then B, it doesn't make sense for him to go to be silent because he'll just get more punishment. It doesn't make sense for you to remain silent because you get more punishment. So this is called an equilibrium, a Nash equilibrium. It's a point where it settles and both of you, it makes sense for you to do this. Okay, now that's the big idea of how we can analyze games in game theory. Now, how does this connect to this week's Sabbath school lesson for those who are studying the quarterly? Well, I was reading this week's lesson, and it talks about things like selfishness and ambition and hypocrisy, and I'm like, that's what's really going on here, right? It's all of those characteristics are coming into play as players think about what is most within their own self-interest in contrast to the other. But what I want to do now is I want to take this way of thinking, this framework, and I want to apply it to three biblical stories, two accounts in the Old Testament, and then one meta account, one big overarching account. And the first one I want to do is I want to do a story from the book of 1 Kings chapter 3, and it's the story involving Solomon and the two mothers. So if you're not familiar with the story in 1 Kings chapter 3, the situation is like this. Two mothers come to Solomon, and one mother shares an account saying, okay, last night, this woman, she rolled over, killed her baby in her sleep, and then she stole mine. And the other woman contested, no, that's my baby. What happened was one baby ended up dying, and now the two mothers are fighting over the remaining baby, whose it is. Is it my baby, or is it your baby? So this is a pretty well-known story. And what is Solomon's solution? What does Solomon say he's going to do?
Cut the baby.
Yeah, he says, bring me a sword, I'll cut the baby in half, you can each have half. And this seems like a bizarre account. Like, what is Solomon thinking? And then after that, there's this epilogue to the story that says, and it was because of this that everyone in Israel revered Solomon's wisdom, right? It's like, this was the thing that made everyone know, wow, he's a wise king. But what I want to suggest Solomon was doing was Solomon was building a game. Solomon built a game. And so I want us to do a similar analysis of this game that Solomon just designed, with the two players being not prisoner A and prisoner B, but two mothers. One will be the real mother, so this is the real mom, and one will be the imposter mother, the false mom. And each of these characters has two choices they can make. The real mom can either agree to Solomon's suggestion. Let's cut the baby in half. It's really a command. Bring me a sword, I'll cut the baby in half. I can agree to that, or she could protest. Or she could protest. In the same way, the false mom could either agree, yeah, let's cut the baby in half, or she could protest. So Solomon has put them in a situation where each has to make a choice whether either going to have to agree or protest with his decision, right? Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to fill in here what would be the preferences of the real mom and the false mom in this scenario. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to use a simple ranking where I'm going to say we'll put 4 if we think that is the best outcome for that player. We'll put 3 if it's a little bit less. We'll put 2 if it's even less, and 1 if we think it's the worst outcome for that player. So let's try this out. For the real mom, what would be the best outcome? Solomon just said, I'm going to cut the baby in half. What does she want to happen? What would she think, what would be her best play? What outcome does she want to see? Does she want to see both moms agree to it? Does she want to see one agree and one disagree? Does she want to see both disagree? I mean, what is the mom interested in? What does the real mom want to do? She wants to save the baby at whatever cost, right? She wants to save the baby. So what would she want to happen to maximize the chance the baby gets saved?
I would say, then I'll give the baby up.
Yeah, okay, but just between these two choices, and she does play a move like that, but between just agree and protest, what's the best way to save the baby?
I would protest.
Yeah, she would protest, and she would hope the other woman would protest too, because that would save the baby, right? If everyone's protesting, no, that's probably her most preferred outcome, would be to see everyone protest the king's command, hoping that it wouldn't come about, that the baby wouldn't be killed. What would be the worst possible thing for the real mom?
Agree with it.
If everyone agreed, if both her and the fake mom say, oh yeah, sure, great idea, cut the baby in half, well, that's going to be the worst possible outcome, because now the baby's almost certainly going to be killed, right? Okay. Now these two are somewhat symmetric. One mom is agreeing and one is protesting. So you might think, okay, it's kind of iffy if the baby's going to live or die. It's not clear. If both were protesting, it'll probably live. If both agree, it'll probably die. If one agrees and one protests, maybe it's like a 50-50 chance the baby lives, the baby dies. But do you think she has any preference between them? Like, if you were the real mom, would you rather be in a universe where you're the one agreeing to have the baby die and someone else is protesting? Or would you rather be in the universe where you're the one protesting and someone else is agreeing? You'd probably want to be the one who's protesting, right? Like, it'd be kind of tough to live with yourself if you're like, yeah, kill the baby, right? Like that would be kind of a tough thing to get away with. So it seems like a preference should be something like this. She ultimately wants both to protest. She would love to see the baby live. A strong protest could stop that. But her worst outcome would be if everyone agrees and then the baby is killed. So this seems to be how the real mom's preferences be ranked. And you can push back on that a little bit, but this seems like a reasonable assumption. How about the false mom? Well, the false mom doesn't actually care about if the baby lives or die, right? The story brings this out. She doesn't care about if the baby lives or die. So what does she really care about? Well, the king just gave some command, and she's interested in having the favor of the king. She wants Solomon to look favorably upon her. And so in that society, it would make sense that the way you get the king's favor is by agreeing with the king. Is that fair? That she doesn't care about the outcome of the baby. She wants the favor of the king. And so she ultimately wants to be agreeing with the king to get his favor. Now, what would give her more favor of the king? If she agrees and the other person agrees, or if she agrees and the other mom disagrees?
She agrees and other mother.
Yeah, that would help her stand out. She'll look, I'm the one who agrees with you, so it'd probably be her best outcome is she agrees with the king, the other person disagrees. Now, if they both agree, that's still pretty good for her because she still agrees, but it's like the favor would be split between the two of them. Her worst move would be if she protested and the other woman agreed, because now we're in a place where this other woman will be gaining the favor of the king, and she'll find herself at odds with the king. And then her second worst would be if they both protest. Okay, so I want to suggest this is a reasonable inference of what the preferences of these two women would be. But let's do the analysis now. What is the best move? Where will they land? Given these preferences, what action would the real mom and the false mom take? Well, let's look at the real mom. If she thinks the other mom's going to agree, which of these would she do? Yeah, she would choose to whatever is a stronger preference. 3 is bigger, so she would protest. Is that fair? And in this other case, if she thought the false mom was going to protest, it's still in her interest to protest, because protest is greater than agreeing. So it seems like the real mom, it's in her interest to protest the decision. On the other hand, with the false mom, where do her interests lead her? Well, we saw the false mom is inclined to agree. Her agree preference is always stronger than her protest preference. So she's inclined to lie here at agree, which would move them to this place. Just like in the prisoner dilemma.
Down.
Oh, sorry. Very good, very good. The protest is below, so they would land here. So just like in the prisoner's dilemma, where their choices lead them somewhere, here the choices lead them somewhere. But notice what happens. There's an asymmetry. One of the moms is protesting, the other mom is agreeing. And so Solomon has created a game where he's rigged their preferences in such a way so that by seeing who protests, he can determine who is the real mom, and by seeing who agrees, he can see who is the false mom. And I want to suggest that Solomon is like the original game theorist, right? He's going through and he's created a game for them to play, very similar to how a cop might create this prisoner's dilemma game. Okay, that's the first story, trying to apply game theory to a biblical account. I want to look at one more story, which has to do with Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. And this is the one, I think, that got me really excited, seeing that this actually, I think, gives some greater insight to what is going on in the story. So you guys are probably familiar with the story in Genesis where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And so I want to suggest this happened here. It's just like how Solomon created a game between the two women, God has created a game now. It's a test, but it's a test in the form of what we can analyze as a game. And so the two people involved in this game, one is Abraham, and the other is God. And so what God has really done is he's invited Abraham to play this game with him. Okay, let me move this over a little bit so you can see Abe. Here's Abraham. Okay. Let's consider the choices in this game. God gives the command, sacrifice your son. So what are Abraham's choices?
Yes or no?
Yeah, he can either choose to sacrifice, he can agree to God's command. So he can either agree, or he could refuse. Right? What are God's choices?
Kill or not kill?
Yeah, he can either uphold his command. So he can either maintain his command, he can uphold his command of, he carries through with it. So he can maintain or uphold his command. Or what's his alternative? Well, he could relent, he could change his mind. And as we know in the story, he does change his mind, at the very end. When I say change his mind, I don't mean that like it was a sudden thing, but it was all along perhaps his attention. I just mean that he relents from his command. He reneges on his command, right? He goes, no, don't do it. Okay. What I want to do is I want to do a similar analysis, trying to look at the preferences of Abraham and God. But what I'm actually going to do for now is I'm going to have us remain agnostic about God's preferences. So let's just assume we don't know what God's preferences are. We don't know if God prefers to uphold or relent. After all, this is the situation Abraham is in. Abraham's in a situation where he doesn't know if he should, what God, is God going to uphold or relent? He's not sure. Maybe there's good evidence why he would suspect one over the other. But let's just say that Abraham is agnostic about God's preferences. Well, let's try and figure out what are Abraham's preferences. Now, I think there are two ways to read the story. One way to read the story is that Abraham's greatest commitment in the story is just to be obedient to God. Let's just assume all Abraham cares about is pure obedience. Because sometimes this is the way we tell the story, that God gave Abraham a command, and it was just like a test of blind faith. Like, forget about the well-being of your son, just be obedient. If that's the case, then what would his preferences look like?
His highest one would be that he agrees, but God relents.
That's right. Like he's definitely going to be preferring agreeing, but he's like, if I'm going to be agreeing, I kind of hope that God would relent, right? Like he can at least hope that God would change his mind. Or maybe a second is, okay, I'm going to agree no matter what, but I recognize that may come at the cost of my son being sacrificed. Okay, and then what would be his least desirable outcome?
The one where he refuses, but it still happens.
Yeah, so he refuses to be obedient, and God still upholds and kills the son. Like that would be pretty bad. And then here would be a second least one. But I want to suggest that this reading of the story makes for a very uninteresting game. No matter what, Abraham's just going to agree, right? He's just going to go out and like, where's the test? What's like? There's no test here. It's just he's going to agree. This is very uninteresting. Maybe you think this is what the text is teaching, but it doesn't seem like anything's really going on here. Because just consistently, no matter what God does, Abraham's just going to agree. It doesn't seem like this is like a very interesting game. So I want to suggest instead of looking at Abraham as just being blindly obedient, we should instead think, okay, what would Abraham do if actually his commitment was to the well-being of his son? Now how would his preferences look? What would be his preferences if instead of assuming he's just committed to blind obedience, what if Abraham's actually committed to the well-being of his son? What would be his optimal outcome?
Refuse, relent.
Okay, so one would be that he refuses God and God relents. I mean, that's pretty good because his son lives. Is there any other category where his son lives?
Agree, relent.
If he agrees and God relents, his son would also live. And in which one of those would be better? Well, since his son lives in both, I think he would like to obey God if he could, as long as he knows his son's going to live, right? So it's like, I'll agree as long as I know God's going to relent. But if I'm not sure God's going to relent, then I won't do that. So his highest would be agreeing if God relents. But his worst would be agreeing and God upholds the command, right? Like that wouldn't be good for him. Okay, great. And then you also have he could refuse to sacrifice his son if God were going to uphold his command. So if he knew God was not going to change his mind, then his best interest would become to refuse the command, and this would make this his second to least. So optimally, he would like to agree if God was going to relent, but if God is going to uphold, then his preference becomes refusing. Is that clear? Abraham's choice now depends upon what he thinks God's going to do. If God's going to relent, or if God's going to uphold the command. And now I think we actually have a real test. You see, in order for this to be a meaningful test, God assumes he's committed to the well-being of his son, but now Abraham has two options, and what he chooses ultimately comes down to what he believes God's going to do, right? So the test of Abraham isn't a question of does he value his son's well-being or not, because this is him optimally valuing his son's well-being, but it ultimately, his choice comes down to what he thinks God's going to do. And so what the test is really revealing is not does he care about his son's life or does he care about blind obedience. The test is really a test of what does he believe God's action is going to be? What does he believe God's preference is? We see that? I think it's a much better telling of the story. God's testing of Abraham is actually God putting Abraham in a situation where God knows Abraham's preferences. If Abraham knows his preferences, he wants his son to live, and if possible, he would like to be obedient. But if he has to refuse God to get his son to live, he's going to do that, right? And now what Abraham has to do, Abraham has to sit there, and Abraham has to do the game theory of trying to reason, well, what do I think God's going to do? And so by Abraham selecting to go through with the sacrifice, it's Abraham indicating that he thinks God has a stronger preference for relenting than for upholding. It's God saying, I believe that God will relent. And actually, you see some evidence of this in the New Testament, right? Hebrews chapter 11, it says that by faith Abraham did this, believing that God could at least resurrect his son from the dead, right? So God, he did not expect God to maintain the command. Okay. So there's one application of game theory that I think is giving some insight into the story that's not actually a story about blind obedience or not caring about your son's well-being. It's actually a test where Abraham has to be put in a situation where Abraham's asked to, okay, try and figure out, is God the kind of God who is merciful and will relent, or is God the kind of God who will uphold this strange command? Good? Okay, one last one. How are we doing on time? Yeah, I think we have time for one last one. And for this last one, I want us to look at the covenant structure overall. And it began in the Old Testament, but this thing leads into the New Testament and the Gospel. And so I'm going to follow the covenant structure of Deuteronomy, where God says, I'm setting before you two things. I'll either bless you, or I'll curse you. And then what is the response that he's expecting of Israel, or more generally of I'll just put humanity, because we know this gets opened up to the rest of the world. What are humanity's choices in this covenant context?
Obey, disobey.
Yeah, humanity can either obey or disobey. Good? Okay, let's try and determine these preferences. And again, we might push back on some of these, but let's try and think. Let's just we're not talking about idealized humanity. We're talking about humanity as it actually is, right? Like humanity as God encounters it, the people of Israel, our own experience. What do you think humanity's preferences would be? What's the best possible outcome for humanity?
I can say the worst would be you obey, but you still get cursed.
That's right. Definitely humanity doesn't want to be in this place where they're obedient to God's commands and they're being, that's like Job, right? This is Job right here. No one wants to be in the place of Job. Right? So, okay, what would be the best? Now, us being sanctified might be like, oh, we're obedient in God's blessing, but probably the history of humanity is we want the blessings, but we don't want to be constrained by the commands, right? Is that fair? It certainly seems like it's characteristic of humanity to say our optimal outcome would be God's blessing us and we're not constrained by these. Okay, so this is humanity as God encounters it, not as God transforms it. Well, and then the second I would say is we really want those blessings, so if we have to, we'd be willing to obey. And then, okay, if we disobey and we're cursed, that's not so great, but even worse would be if we obey and we're cursed. Does this seem like a reasonable description of what appears to be like the preferences of people throughout history and time, right? How about God? Now, then maybe this makes it a little more challenging. It's a little bit tough, what is God? But surely we can identify what God's best possible outcome is. What does God really want from the world? God really wants a world where he is blessing his people and his people are obedient. Right? Is that fair? What would be his least optimal outcome?
Burn them all.
Yeah, so some kind of cursing, right? Although God does seem willing to curse his people when they're disobedient. So his least optimal seems to be when he's cursing them when they're obedient. God doesn't want to do anything like that. It pains God to go through the story of Job, right? God wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the adversary and the larger context going on there. Okay, so here maybe there's a little bit of where should we put God's preferences? It's not exactly clear. Would God rather bless his people when they're disobedient? Or would he rather curse them when they're disobedient? Well, the fact that the covenant structure is saying when you're disobedient, I'll send curses, is telling us something. And while God does want to bless his people, he doesn't want them to remain in disobedience. So it does seem like there's a sense in which God, would curse them in disobedience, hoping to move them to obedience, right? And then, slightly less preference to bless them in disobedience. So I think this fits generally well with the overall structure of especially the Old Testament and the covenant as we encounter it there, like in Deuteronomy, in the Exodus, and then the unfolding of the history of Israel. But let's look at what has just happened. Where's the optimal place? Where do we want to be? Where's the Bible hoping to get us to? What's the grand hope? It'll be this top left, right? We want to be here. But is that a stable place?
What do you mean by stable?
Well, let's think. if humanity is here and then God is here, is it within the best interests of humanity and in the best interest of God to remain here? Well, in God's case, yes. God wants to keep blessing because he'd rather bless than curse humanity when humanity is obedient, right? But how about in the case of humanity? What would humanity, is this the best choice for them? Well, if God is blessing, would they want to stay obedient? No, their preference is to disobey, right? So there's an instability here that pushes it down. God's blessing, they're being obedient, but then they have a stronger preference for disobedience, so it moves down. 4 is greater than 3. And we see this in the history of the Bible, right? God's blessing Israel until Israel moves into disobedience. And then what happens? Well, we see here the 2 gets trumped by 3. Now God's preference moves. And you see this in the history of Israel, that God now reacts by no longer blessing, but cursing humanity. And then we end up down here. Humanity is disobedient, and God is sending some kind of punishment or curse upon them. This is like the Old Testament story, right? Hoping to move them back to obedience. But the problem is, although this first position wasn't stable, this one is. Right? Like it's no longer within humanity's interest to move to obedience, because they have a smaller preference for obedience than disobedience under the situation of God's curses. And it's no longer advantageous for God to change from cursing to blessing, because he has a stronger preference here. So we land in this very stable, awful situation. And maybe this gives like some way of thinking about like the Old Testament story of God keep moving people here, but why they keep falling back to the situation. Yeah.
One of the things I think I'm seeing is that mercy is always a part of justice, of reaching justice. The mother was merciful on the other woman's grief and her child, and you had justice.
Yeah.
And in the story of Abraham and Isaac, mercy from God brought the prophecy of justice.
Yeah. Yeah, so what happens then, and maybe this is like one way to understand the gospel, like here's the Old Testament problem. the gospel solution, which we've even seen in the Old Testament, requires 2 steps. How do we get back here? Well, 2 steps have to happen. There has to be something on the human side. What do we call this on the human side? Moving from disobedience to obedience. We would call that something like repenting. There needs to be a step of repentance. So it's like just acting within self-interest. We've moved down here. That's bad. So a step of repentance moves us up. That's the human side. And then what happens on the divine side? A step of forgiveness, right? Of God relenting, when God relents. So people repent and God relents, and it's this 2-step that moves us back to the starting quadrant. The problem is, in the Old Testament, like it remains unstable, right? Like time and time again, God will be blessing these people who are obedient, but then they fall into this place where they're experiencing God's curses because of the disobedience. And so then there's a time of repenting and relenting that moves you back here, and then you fall back. So then what ultimately has to happen in order to make this stable? Well, I want to suggest what ultimately has to happen is humanity's preferences need to change. And so this is what this language of new heart is all about. Like the job of the Holy Spirit, this promise of Jeremiah, I'll give you a new heart. What that's really saying is God changes the preferences of his people so they're no longer preferring disobedience to obedience, but they actually come to prefer obedience over disobedience. Right? That the God's people actually now come to see, okay, being obedient is more preferable than being disobedient. And once that preference change takes place, once they're given a new heart, it's now a stable equilibrium. Now you can stay in a place of blessing and obedience because you're no longer being pulled downward and into disobedience and then into curses. And so one way to understand the gospel is there's this problem of moving down because our preferences are misaligned, and then we always move back, but it's not stable. But it's the process of sanctification, being given a new heart, that stabilizes us in a state of blessing and obedience. Okay. Well, that's my attempt to argue that game theory can help us make sense of a couple particular Bible stories, as well as perhaps the larger narrative of scripture overall, and try to understand what's going on with the gospel.